could easily talk for 2 hours and a half, but sometimes we had to cut the interview because they had to go to lunch or they had to go somewhere. So most of the interviews were between 1 hour to 2 hours long. And between 1 hour to 2 hours long speaking is like probably 6 or 7, maybe 8 hours typing. Right. Yeah. Per interview. So if you think about that, yeah, it is fairly expensive. And then because a lot of our material is in Spanish, a lot of the interviews were in Spanish, we also had to translate. So, and luckily all of us are bilingual, so we were able to do that, but it's still a lot of work.
Did the students, 2 hours, because you need to type 8 hours.
Did the students miss instruction time for the interviews?
To the students, yes, they did. But we always interviewed at the end of the semester when testing was over. And that sometimes when, at the end of the day, when the teacher would allow us to. Yeah, and that's one thing that could be an issue, that they were missing instruction. Yeah.
You talked about that your first article that's in process. I'm thinking about the ethics involved and I know we haven't read the article and all, but how do you deal with that? No, you said that Mrs. O is a wonderful teacher, and yet your article is based on the comment she made about the side conversations, lost opportunities. How do you it's a good teaching point, and so you don't want to miss that yourself. But how do you deal with the ethical part of it? Where not to make her feel horrible. You know what I mean?
Right, and I think that's something that the team has really been talking about, in particular with this publication.
Yes.
Because the others, we haven't had issues with that. But this one, because this one we're focusing on the negative, we are thinking exactly about what some of you mentioned. We're thinking of framing it through standardized testing and the pressures, or through, we need to do more research on this particular area of why critical discourse is still not being implemented in the classroom. And not to frame it as she being a bad teacher, right. But that a lot of us teachers are still not willing to talk about the issues.
Or like you said earlier, if you have to go back to your research and to see if it's the teachers or if it's the testing and that kind of thing. I mean, I just saw that up there again, and I'm thinking, and that ethical question was coming out. Okay, thank you.
Well, and to interject there, I was thinking this you mentioned the lack of critical conversations, which I think part of it has to do with that we still see them as children, and that we somehow feel like they're not ready to have that conversation, even though they're children, which is an odd irony when you consider all the violence and things that they've been exposed to.
Sure.
I mean, it's just it's a weird perception that I feel is a teacher perception of students.
May I comment on that? I think another piece of it is that a lot of teachers don't want to give up the control of if they let students talk to each other, or I see that a lot. They're like, I'm not gonna. Basically, they see themselves as losing the authority in the classroom when they start letting the kids have the conversations instead of them leading it and directing it.
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely that would go back to what I was talking about before. I mean, that particular accepted learning theory is not necessarily. I mean, a lot of, especially test-driven classrooms are very behaviorist. It seemed like they were very behaviorist in that classroom because they're preparing for the test. And so, whereas more of the dialogic vaccine type of theories are not really being used in social studies, which is the best place to use it.
I agree. I teach social studies content. But and I see where you're coming from, but I also think that this might be an opportunity to sit down with Ms. O and share with her what we found, and then to talk about it, and to talk about, okay, why didn't you get deeper into the conversation? Why didn't you talk about this or that? Or what could you have done differently? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe she'll become a more critical teacher. Maybe she won't.
In science, You put up a hypothesis and experiment and test it and draw conclusions. So what conclusions would you draw from this? From this research study, what conclusions do you have now?
What conclusions do I have from the research study? Wow, I don't think I have any yet. We're so in the thick of things right now.
Mhm.
We're I'm not sure there's a conclusion. I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well-
To me, I don't see any conclusions. I
Okay.
see,
So, no, basic insights, basic truths that have been derived from this. Do you have any?
I think one of the biggest ones for me from this particular study was about the violence in Juarez, that we see a lot of reports about the violence in Juarez. We see a lot of it through the media, through books being written, but none of them from the perspective of the children. And we don't see what it's doing to the children. And these kids are telling us all these profound stories
So
of
it-
how it's affecting them.
It seriously impacted their academic abilities? Okay.
It
that's a
impacted
conclusion.
the whole school. I think it impacted the whole district, and this particular district where we were working in. And we saw that when we interviewed the social worker and the counselor, they were not prepared to deal with this. So I think for me, that was the major insight from this.
So now we need to do a
particular study.
follow-up study in Syria.
Yeah, we need to kind of look at how that
Nobody
violence.
gets more violence in Syria.
Or some of the, African countries, right?
Few of those, too.
Or some of the kids that have
Rwanda.
come from Honduras, which is also extreme violence.
I guess to draw a conclusion, you would want to look back at your research question. What was it?
How to transnational Mexican children transform community, cultural, personal, and social skills for negotiating academic life. So we were looking at the transfronterizo knowledge that they were using, they were gaining in Juarez, and how they're using it in El Paso, including their knowledge of violence.
So couldn't that be your conclusion? The answer to that question that you got from the study?
We have a lot of them, though. There's not like one specific conclusion. There's a lot of different ones that I can think of right now. And science and social studies with the violence, with their own identity, as people coming from Juarez, as dual language students. A lot of different conclusions to me.
Any other questions? No? Okay, so let's give it up for her. Okay, let me take a break. It's 6.